So Ted, can I call on you first? Is that okay?
Sure. Unfortunately, I didn't get to finish what I was trying to write. I'm going to finish it, though, in the next month or so. So I think the idea is to look at the world situation and the situation in the United States within that, and particularly focusing on the 2024 elections. So I don't know if any of you read the thing that I posted last night. It was just the beginnings of what I want to say. I'm not going to repeat what I wrote. I think the political situation in the world is radically different than what we have lived through in our lifetimes. And I think most of us are old enough to have lived through a lot. The old Stalinist and social democratic and radical nationalist, third world nationalist political parties of the world are dead and dying. Dead and dying. What happened to the powerful French Communist Party? Where is it? What happened to the powerful Italian Communist Party? Where is it? Excuse me?
But it was an echo. Go ahead.
What happened to the AFL-CIO?
So not long ago.
What happened to the Congress Party of India? Where is it? What happened to Baathism in the Middle East? These parties are remnants of themselves, or they have become transformed into vicious capitalist dictatorships, like the KGB dictatorship in Russia, now under a new name, like Xi Jinping's authoritarian communist capitalist regime in China. This is a thing of the past. It's something we have to explain why it happened, but it didn't just happen to Stalinism and social democracy. Think about it. What is happening to the Conservative Party, the Tories in England? They're fucking falling apart. Where is Rally for the Republic, La République? Where are the Gaullists in France? Down the toilet. The capitalist parties of the world are also falling apart. We have to explain it. So we don't have time to explain it here today. And we don't even probably have a complete explanation, none of us. If you look at the United States has, by reputation, and in fact, the most stable capitalist state that has ever existed. It's based on the Constitution of 1787. And on top of that, a two-party political system. But underlying that, something more important, a system of patriarchy and apartheid that prevented the working class of the United States from arising as one single unified class. Instead, you had a fragmented class divided by race, divided by gender, women subordinated to men, to working class men. And all of the working class stratified by ethnicity and religion. What a disaster. And when the working class movement formed, the AFL-CIO, Black workers and women workers struggled to be in it. And they won partially. And then they continued to struggle, and they knocked down the apartheid system of the United States. They knocked down the gender system of the United States. Not completely, but they fucking wrecked a lot of its foundations. And our generation, mostly the generation of activists and people on the left from the 1960s and 70s, participated in wrecking the foundations of the American system of apartheid and patriarchy. We did it. You know, when I was a kid, girls wore skirts to school, period. Not now. When I was a kid, gay people didn't exist. Not now. And when I was a kid, everybody in San Leandro was white and everybody in East Oakland was black. Not now. We changed things. And we created the great possibility of a united, independent, self-conscious working class in the United States. We did that. And now the capitalist parties are in crisis. Both of them. How many minutes do I have, Cheryl or Linda?
Well, you've been speaking for 6 minutes. So.
Okay. Am I supposed to keep
No,
time?
no, Linda, I'll keep the time for this meeting. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Because we're not really doing time. So go ahead, Ted. So I'll give you 4 more minutes max. And then you can come in again later after other people have spoken, if you're still here.
Okay, so I'm going to end it here. What we see now is a crisis within the capitalist class. Capitalist politics is a politics of one faction of the bourgeoisie or another, mobilizing workers and petty bourgeois for their own factional interests within their class. That's what the Democratic Party is. That's what the Republican Party is. And one faction of capitalism in the United States is becoming desperate. Why? 3 reasons. Global warming is going to fuck up fossil fuels. It's true. The capitalist class of the world says, the rational part of the capitalist class says, we have to save our system. So we have to make a transition from fossil fuels to other kinds of energy. Otherwise, we're going to kill ourselves and our system. You know, why kill the golden goose? Keep it alive. And another faction says, fuck that. We're going to be dead. Let's make money while we can. We need fossil fuels. We need to sell methamphetamines too. So that section of the capitalist class is becoming desperate. 1. The rate of profit of capitalist production has fallen to close to 0. It's natural. Read volume 1 of Capital. And capitalists look for other ways to make money. How?
Ted, that's 8 minutes.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So this section of the capitalist class in the United States, known under the rubric of the Republican Party, is desperate. They want to change the political system. And they want to remove people from the voters, from the right to vote. They want a more authoritarian system. They have 2 sides. Those who will do it through a coup d'etat or any other illegal means, Donald Trump, and those who want to do it constitutionally, Mitch McConnell. And then on the other side, you have the Democratic Party, which depends on the survival of the 2-party system. And they guarantee the survival of the Republican Party no matter what. Because if the Republican Party dies, the Democratic Party will have to make good on all of its false promises. This is a crisis at the top of the system. And the working class, especially the youth, see it that way. They don't support the young workers, the young Black women workers don't support the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. The United States is ripe for political change, except we have the dead bodies of the old left standing in the way. They're not going to stand in the way too long, but they are standing in the way now. And you get Cornel West taking over the Green Party. One of the things we succeeded in building is going down the shithole because the Putinists are taking it over.
Ted, that's 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, good. Okay, all right. Ben, would you like to speak? Because I know you've only got an hour. And you're muted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So I'll keep this very short to respect people's time and to acknowledge that I am not prepared really to say anything that would be that good. But just briefly to introduce myself, I've been an activist all my adult life, and I take a long-term view. And I'm focused on the crisis of the left, which I think is related to the crisis of theory, which makes people stupid and is confusing everyone and results in a lot of things being built on a foundation of sand. That's all I'll say at this right now. And Ted, I'd like to thank you for your comments, and I may need to lie down, but I'll be listening for the hour that I'll be able to attend, and that's it.
Okay. Let's see some other hands raised here. It's open. Surely someone wants to speak. John, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I agree with much of what Ted said, but I think that he's trying to impose a template of the past on the present. And in the past, we always saw bourgeois politics as reflecting divisions within the capitalist class. And what we're not seeing today, or what many people, I believe, including Ted, or the vision that he puts forward, is not seeing today, is the degree to which the capitalist class as a whole has lost its influence over U.S. society and well, yeah, I'll just put it like that. Just in today's foreign affairs, I have an article, election deniers continue to work in some election offices around the country. They go on, they won more than 170 races in 2022. The continued widespread dissemination and acceptance of lies about the election poses an existential threat to U.S. democracy. That such falsehoods continue to be embraced should worry all Americans. And I don't think that this is like one wing of the capitalist class versus another. And you cannot just dismiss the unprecedented crisis that exists in the United States today. And as an example of that, you see the Fitch has just lowered its credit ratings for the United States, precisely because of the political crisis that exists. And look at what's happened with Trump, who was a money launderer for one of the capitalists of one of the main competing imperialist countries for the United States, the Russian oligarchs. He undercut the most important alliance for the United States, the NATO alliance. Both the military and the intelligence wings of the state, of the federal government, broke with Trump. Now, you want to talk about the oil industry? The Koch brothers and the oil industry as a whole do not support Trump. Because, and there was an article, I forget where, explaining that Trump is so disruptive and the oil industry wants stability. Let's not forget Rex Tillerson, who is kind of the oil industry personified, who broke with Trump. Then you had, he tried to organize an insurrection of the Capitol. He was called a traitor by some of the top, like former people in the CIA and so on. This is unprecedented. And I could go on and on about that, but there's no reason for any wing of the US capitalist class to want to overturn its traditional method of rule at this time. What they all, and you want to talk about the Democrats, well, the Democrats are desperately clinging to the old, what they call bipartisanship, which is a collaboration between the two parties. But that's gone. So, and I agree with Ted that this is the US version of a global process, but it does not serve the interests of any wing of the capitalist class. And where Ted and I have a strong disagreement is on what is the actual state of affairs in the US working class. Now, in the past, Ted has denied that there's any significant sector of the working class that supports Trump. I produced some of the statistics, and it was only some, including the fact that 40% of voters who have a union member in their household voted for Trump in 2020. In 2020, that was a decrease from what it was in 2016. I mentioned, well, it's my sister who lives in rural Pennsylvania, who said every single worker she knows in that area supports Trump. And she told me, I said, where do they work at? She mentioned 3 different factories. So she's doesn't have the petty bourgeois confused with workers or so on. That was 20, she said, was at least 20 people. Now, you can dismiss that as anecdotal if you like, but at a certain point, there's no reason to think that these people are an extreme exception. And at a certain point, anecdotes become statistics. So we have to look at what is happening in the working class. And, there is, it would be undialectical, it would be non-Marxist to think that a 50-year war against all the best traditions of the labor movement in this country and against socialism, a war that was carried out not only by the capitalist class, but by the leaders of the working class that we have, which is the union leadership, to think that that has not had a profound effect on workers in this country, and it absolutely has. Most workers that I know, that I've talked to in Oakland, who are union members, you ask them what union they belong to, they don't even know the name of their union. So there is this massive confusion and also a certain amount of passivity within the working class, that the issues we face is not up to me as a worker to deal with them. And most of them, will feel like I just don't want to be bothered one way or another. Any union activist you talk to will report on the tremendous difficulty of getting workers involved. So I don't want to, I'm not by any means dismissing the working class as the revolutionary factor, as the subjective factor in history, but we have to recognize these enormous difficulties that we face. So those are the main points that I would make. And just to stress, we cannot continue viewing the present through the eyes of the past. When Trump got elected, that was a shock to me. And then when he did not become just like any other Republican president, that was an even bigger shock. And it made me sit back and think, well, there's something in the United States that I've been missing. And I think that we all have to, it made me look at things through fresh eyes. And I think we all have to do that, be willing to do that to a certain extent. I'm finished.
Linda.
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, Ted brings up something that I've always wondered about. He dates the crisis within the ruling class gains made by people oppressed by nationalities, gender, and gender orientation and things like that. Whereas the capitalist class is really only interested in oppression on the basis of class. They want just to extract the surplus value. They can get more surplus value from more oppressed people, and especially in the third world, but the real basis for oppression under capitalism is class. And yet, you can see that in some capitalist countries, they've gone a long ways towards granting women and minorities, equal rights, with white men or whoever's the top dog in these countries. The Scandinavian countries. I mean, it's just a puzzle to me. I mean, how much does capitalism really need the super exploitation and all the hassles that go with it? And plus they've had to face this big fight back from members of minorities and women's groups. So there's that, and then on John's thing about the working class, I wouldn't go. I think he's going at it backwards in a way. I mean, his point of departure is legitimate, but I was looking at things like who got arrested on January 6th, and the Atlantic Monthly did a pretty good analysis of this. It's really hard to find analysis like these too, that digs into the demographics of who really supports Trump. But they found that a lot of the people there were actually members of the petty bourgeoisie, and that they were older, significantly older. Like especially if you compare them to fascist groups of the past, where there's mostly young men in their 20s. These people were were over 40, a lot of them, and which just feels really young to me. But they didn't fit a general description of the working class. I mean, they didn't represent every sector of the working class. I think they represented maybe what would be called a privileged layer, or people that are kind of halfway between, who have jobs and maybe a union membership, but they're basically petty bourgeoisie. They're basically selling things, or I just don't know. I mean, nobody really digs into it. I mean, it's kind of a taboo subject, I think, in this country. But they don't. There were no young workers, very few minority workers, and the only workers that were present in large numbers were vets and law enforcement. Sometimes, vets are former military and there's some active military too, actually. So I mean, we're facing a very confusing time. I don't think I think the past is still legit, is still relevant though. A lot of the old categories, they look obsolete, but they really aren't. I mean, you got two or three imperialist blocks, and at least one block is going fascist because they're basically revisionist imperialists. They didn't get a good shake. They lost their near colonies that they're trying to force back into their empire, and they're also trying to get colonies abroad, like in Africa and China's the same way. But I'm talking about Russia. I mean, you got two revisionist imperial blocks that they don't want to obey the rules. They don't want to recognize borders. They don't want to. But by play by the rules, I mean they don't want to play by the rules of war. They don't want to. They basically pose a lethal threat to the U.S. and European imperial bloc. And when Hitler came to power, this bloc didn't really recognize the threat. They let Hitler just take over everything and kill everybody until they finally realized they had to go to war with him. This time they're trying to intercept the process, or short circuit the process by arming Ukraine. It's almost like if the U.S. and Europe had armed the Spanish in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, it makes for a really jumble, and of course you got people on the left supporting the rogue imperialist powers, which was something I would never have predicted. But anyway, I mean that's kind of the way I'm viewing it. And why is there this crisis? I mean, you get the crisis because of the dispute between these imperialist blocs, but I'm also looking at the whole subject of kleptocracy. and dark money and stuff that money that's hidden away, that's been accumulated one way or another. And they're just these huge sums, sitting stagnant someplace, or sometimes they're like, I heard one time in the 80s or 90s that the amount of illicit money from the global drug trade was the only thing keeping the global capitalist system afloat. Because it doesn't just sit, it doesn't just, it isn't just tucked away like the oligarchs do, but it's actually funding, it's actually circulating through the system. But I mean, there's a lot of things to look at, and we got a lot of stupid people that are really making the analysis hard and making it hard to try and educate other people. And I think that's kind of where we're at. That's all I have to say.
Okay, Henry.
Okay, so speaking here from Toronto, Canada, of course, I observe what goes on in the United States and very concerned about what's going on there, especially since those of us who are socialists know that the future of socialism anywhere in the world depends on the success of socialism in the United States. That's something that we've known for over a century. And so when socialism is in crisis in the United States, we're all a little bit worried. I, observed with horror the decline of the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States and the demise of the IS, both of which I think thought in their day had some potential and had done real good work. As far as I know, they're virtually gone now. And how did this express itself in the United States in recent years? The amazing American genius for organizing, which we all try to learn from, really did not show itself in some major tests in the last few years. I was concerned. Well, we've seen the demise also. Of course, the demise of labor organizing. I mean, unionization has been on the decline for years in the States. I think it's about 25% overall. In Canada, it's gotten up to 30% recently, which is really pathetic. There's been some important movements in the United States recently organizing Amazon workers and Starbucks workers, some of the most precarious workers and most exploited workers. But where I began to notice that things aren't working the way they're supposed to work on the left in the United States is when Trump started to rise. And when Trump started to rise, okay, there was an amazing support Bernie Sanders campaign, and there was an amazing movement. There's an amazing Black Lives Matter movement, and there was an amazing Women's March movement. And they all more or less came to a head at the inauguration of Trump, and then they all went home. The amazing organization built around Bernie Sanders, the amazing organization Black Lives Matter, and the amazing Women's March just didn't continue. They just didn't continue. Instead of saying, okay, now's the time to mobilize against Trumpism. And throughout the Trumpist presidency, they were basically, back to electoral politics and back to business as usual. Very concerning, very, very concerning. People was talking about they're scared and worried. I began to be worried about the state of the international left about 15 years ago, when there was the amazing civil war in Sri Lanka and the uprising in the Tamil part of Sri Lanka, and the amazing need for solidarity on a world scale with the Tamil insurgency, and nothing, absolutely nothing. The Tamils were totally isolated. They tried to have little pickets and protests in front of different places in different parts of the world, but the left that had an amazing heritage of solidarity with oppressed people, especially people who are not just being repressed, but are uprising and actually fighting. Nothing. Zilch. Fuck all. Then the Syrian Popular Uprising, absolutely clear, not debatable, not controversial, that the Syrian Popular Uprising was a mass-based, truly popular uprising of workers and peasants with a general democratic thrust, targeting the regime and wanting freedom, not an Islamist thrust at all. For years, yes, there was an Islamist current, but that did not characterize the Syrian Popular Uprising. And the entire socialist, communist, anti-imperialist, solidarity with Palestine left, all of that basically turned its back on what was obviously, visibly, palpably a truly mass-based popular uprising against an oppressor regime. Nothing, really nothing. And that sort of set the stage for, in the case of a truly reactionary war in Central and Eastern Europe, a reactionary war clearly on the Russian Federation side, clearly a war of oppression and domination. Inability, unwillingness, total corrupt political values, just from too long a legacy of not resisting oppression, too long a legacy of not standing up to oppression, not able to express solidarity with those who clearly need solidarity. So I'm still call myself a socialist and doing the best I can locally, etc. But I agree with Ted that there's a crisis, or maybe it wasn't Ted, maybe it was somebody else who said the crisis of revolutionary theory. I agree with that. There cannot be a crisis of revolutionary leadership without a crisis of revolutionary theory, but there's also a crisis of revolutionary action and revolutionary instincts to solidify with the oppressed in struggle. That has basically been destroyed over the past couple of decades, and that is what concerns me very much. Thank you for listening.
Howie.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ted saying that, the potential is there for working class unity. And if the old left is standing in the way, I think the nonprofit industrial complex even more so, because they got more money and influence. But I want to make the case for the independent left running its own candidates, even in this current situation, because if we don't, we disappear. We're out of the discussion. And I would argue that Green candidates and others on the independent left more often improve elections rather than spoil them. A classic example is Henry Wallace in 1948. Truman was way behind Dewey until he adopted Wallace's progressive economic policies and also a little bit of the civil rights program by desegregating the army. And Truman made a big comeback to beat Dewey. I can tell you about two instances here in Syracuse, which has had Republican representatives in the House for over 50 years. The only time a Democrat was elected was when a Green ran. And it changed the whole dynamic because the centrist Democrat was suddenly discussing the issues the Greens were bringing up and made the right-wing Republican look extremist. And we got 6 to 8% of the vote as Greens, and the Democrats still crushed the Republicans. So I think it's the wrong assumption to assume if the Greens are running, they're going to split the center-left vote. They bring more voters out. Jill Stein, the exit polls from 2016 showed that 61% of her voters would have stayed home if she wasn't on the ballot. Ralph Nader's 2000 campaign brought out more voters and made the difference in Michigan and Washington for Debbie Stabenow and Maria Cantwell. Those people got elected to Senate because of the additional votes that came out with Nader, and it kept the Senate Democratic. So I think it's not accurate to say that, the Greens will just split and then split the vote. And then look at Biden, the Democrats, they don't fight the fascists in the Republican Party. Biden's still talking about bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow his election. And what he's doing is normalizing the fascist Republicans. And then, the voting rights bill that was the top priority for the Democrats in the Congress, he never took on a filibuster in order to get that passed. So, that could have been done and it wasn't. And then you look at his immigration policies. He's Trump without the racist rhetoric in terms of practical effect. And we're in a situation now where the left of the Democratic Party, Sanders and the squad, has already endorsed Biden with making no demands. So the whole dynamic is moving to the right. I would also note, and this is independent of who you're going to support in these elections, there's a real movement now to open up the political process with ranked choice voting, and particularly ranked choice voting in multi-member districts, which creates proportional representation in legislative bodies. We had in the early 2000s, we increased from 0 to about 20 jurisdictions going into 2020. Now they're 51. And if Nevada repeats what it did in the referendum in 2022, when it comes up again, I think 2024, it'll be over 100 jurisdictions. And there's legislation in many states to move that way. And what that does is open up the process in a way that the left can run without having to deal with the spoiler problem. It eliminates the spoiler problem. And I think that's something that we really need to, as the left, push at this time, because you open up the political system, get rid of the spoiler problem, then the left can get in there without, being demonized as, splitting the vote and electing the Republicans. And the last point I'll make is, I think it's wrong to characterize Cornel West as a Putinist. I had that briefing with Cornel and Dennis Pilash this week. And Dennis, he was outstanding. It's the best presentation I've ever seen him give. And I think he and Cornel resonated on the basic, values and issues. In fact, I said afterwards, I'd like to have each of you on my podcast at different times. And Cornel said, let's do it together and make this discussion public. So Cornel, he's not a Putinist. Ajamo Baraka tells him to stop criticizing Russia. And Cornel said, I told Ajamo he's not. He's not going to stop calling Putin a gangster and Russia an empire. In fact, we've lost people from the Putinists in the Green Party. I know some of you in the Bay Area may unfortunately know Paul LaRuti, big Putinist, big Assadist. He quit the party publicly saying Cornel West had criticized Russia, China, and Iran. So I'm just saying, I don't think Cornel's got the position exactly like we'd like it, but I think he's moving that way. And as far as the Green Party, the Putinists haven't taken over. There's a small contingent of Putinists in the debates we've had over Ukraine. And they tend to influence I call them the conspiritualists, kind of the new agey, anti-scientific people that fall for all these conspiracy theories like, COVID vaccines are a, plot to depopulate the world and so forth. They have taken the position against arms to Ukraine. And then there's a pacifist contingent, but it's really pretty much 50-50 inside the Green Party on that debate. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have more discussion.
Walter. Walter.
Okay, managed to unmute. As I guess people know, I sent out a document about mostly focusing on strategy for the 2024 elections. So I won't deal with that today, but deal with some of the questions that have come up. And I hope we can have a written discussion on the election question. I hope Howie, for example, can write up some of what he just said, which is interesting, but I'd like to see specifics written down. First of all, I liked a lot of what Ted said at the beginning, and it's important, I think, that he referred to the falling profit rate as driving, particularly the far right wing of the capitalist class, like the Republicans, to really try to overthrow the gains that were made by working class and oppressed people in the 30s and the 60s. The Supreme Court is well on the way to doing what it can, and the Republicans are attempting this two-pronged attempt at enshrining minority rule through both the constitutional wing and the Trumpist more violent wing. I disagree, though. Ted said that the rate of poverty had gone down to near zero. I'm not aware of that. I try to follow Michael Roberts and others like that who try to make calculations using what statistics are available, and I haven't seen that. And I would actually tend to doubt it. Ever since China and so much of the former Stalinist ruled countries was opened up to Western imperialism, the rate of profit has gone back up through the super exploitation of, in the case of China, hundreds of millions of migrant workers who barely earn enough to reproduce the proletariat. And in fact, Linda asks, what's the real importance of super exploitation? I would say today it's huge, and that capitalism fundamentally depends on that. So, you know, that's my way. I would amend what Ted said. Otherwise, I thought had a lot of agreement with that. Just a small comment on John's anecdotal report about his sister in Pennsylvania. You talked about she has spoken with about 20 workers, all of whom were factory workers. What about more female sections of the workforce, like restaurant workers or healthcare workers? I suspect the attitude towards Trump would be very different, and I'd like you to ask your sister to talk to some of them as well. Again, would be anecdotal, but would give a wider view of the actual working class. Henry went into some of the questions about the weakness of the U.S. left, and I want to talk about that a bit. You mentioned the three movements: the Sanders campaign, the women's movement, the Black Lives movement, women's movement over which broke out, the huge women's march after Trump's inauguration. I would just comment, we went to that march in New York, and it was overwhelmingly a pro-Hillary Clinton march, just angry at the fact that Hillary had not won the election. I didn't see any particular working class section of that. New York may not have been typical, but New York had a massive component in that march, and it wasn't working class at all. But the other ones, the Sanders campaign that Henry mentioned, and the Black Lives Movement, I think one of the great, the American left today is largely DSA, other organizations having been either disappeared or dissolved into it. And DSA has played a terrible role in not offering leadership, played no role at all nationally in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is absolutely criminal. Obviously, many DSA members did participate out of their own political instincts and correct instincts, but the organization didn't offer no leadership whatsoever. Likewise, the electorally, which DSA so focuses on, they did not even attempt to take, and they still don't take positions on which candidates might be better for the working class. Leaving aside for the moment, I argue this in my written statement about whether it's principled or not to vote for Democrats, but DSA obviously thinks it is principled to vote for some Democrats, since they backed Bernie Sanders and others. But when it came to the question of defeating Trump in 2020, DSA as an organization abstained, and that again is I thought a criminal activity on the left. So I'd like to get into the question of why there's so many socialists who are Putinists or back Assad or take that approach to socialism. I came into the socialist movement through what was then the Independent Socialists, that was one of the ancestors of the later IS. And the defining pamphlet of that organization at the time was Hal Draper's pamphlet, The Two Souls of Socialism, Socialism from Above and Socialism from Below. There are some terrible things wrong with that pamphlet. Among other things, it did not discuss the Bolshevik Revolution and wouldn't comment on which kind of socialism that was, which is, a huge omission. But there was a basic idea that in that pamphlet that was correct, namely that socialists, like people in this room, believe that socialism is to defend the oppressed and exploited and end their oppression and exploitation through mass action by mass and conscious action by the working class. Where socialism from above means the socialism of experts who know better how to run society. And there are so many socialists who I've seen in Zooms and so forth who admire China because they're doing just that. They know how to run a society. I would say they know how to run a capitalist society, but nevertheless, and they admire that very much. And that's a whole different strand of socialism, which in my opinion, doesn't even deserve the word socialist, but nevertheless, you can't control the dictionary. And people take that view. And it's worth trying to, I think, rewriting Hal Draper's pamphlet and taking into account the question of leadership, and therefore discussing the Soviet Revolution in 1917 would be a useful thing to do. But it's just a basic idea of why there is this huge difference on the left. Nevertheless, the DSA is having its national convention this weekend, as I understand it, and is probably not going to adopt the defense of Ukraine position that some have put forward. And I don't know how to relate to DSA, but I think since it is the biggest organization on the left, if we want to have a national impact, we have to figure out how to relate to that organization and win over so many of the socialists, especially young socialists who were there.
Oh, Walter, that's 8 minutes. Did you want? Okay. All right. Rick, go ahead.
I'm muted. I'd like to talk about the crisis in the left and not so much about what I wrote, although that plays into it. I feel that much of what we see in the positions that are so prominent today, both in the socialist and in the non-socialist left, go way back. It goes back obviously before the left arose in the anti-war, anti-imperialist, and subsequent movements that arose out of those and initially arose out of the modern civil rights movement, which is the largest mass movement in United States history ever. It involved tens and tens of millions of people. What we're seeing today is a profound lack of understanding of revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice. I can think of every left group I've ever been in, and the number one weakness was political education. Every sectlet, every kind of massy organization eschewed political education or substituted their own very limited kind of sectoral thinking about political questions. And we see that today in so many ways. We see how class unity is reduced to friendship, how white and male supremacy is pushed aside, how international solidarity is reduced. I mean, the reductionism, I guess, is quite profound. There have been so many things that have been said here so far. I just will comment on a few here. Howie, as to the points that you made about the importance of independent left political candidates, I can see it, but I can only see it if somebody runs that has ties to mass working class or oppressed organizations and can tie those struggles into their candidacy. Candidacy shouldn't be about we're trying to get elected because we're, we want to break down, we want to defeat the Democrats and Republicans. We're trying to build a mass working class movement. And if people run and they don't talk about, if they don't relate their politics to the struggles of the working class, to the struggles of Black, Latinos, women, trans rights, etc., then they shouldn't run at all. They're wasting their time and they're wasting everybody else's time. Henry made an outstanding point about Syria, and it's the collapse of the U.S. left, the Canadian left, the international left is seen most blatantly in the refusal to support the Syrian social revolution. It's seen today in the dismissal of the Chinese oppression, fascist oppression of Uyghurs. It's seen, and a point about Syria relates to the left that thinks and feels that it's very anti-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. Because in Syria, the Palestinians who rallied to the Syrian revolutionary side were cast aside by the so-called pro-Palestinians. Leftists, just abandoned completely. That's how I got into politics. I got thrown off an Israeli kibbutz in Israel in 1963 and came back here to the US and looking for answers, basically got shunned by the entire Jewish community, and that radicalized me. Now, somebody, I can't remember who said this, I'm kind of going all over the place, but that there's a weakening of bourgeois ideas among the working class. If somebody didn't say that, I apologize, but I see a strengthening of bourgeois ideas among the working class. We see that basically white male working class voters are MAGA voters. They're extremely reactionary. In the abstract, they may actually be for certain things that improve working class life, but you can't do it when you support your class enemy. I think I should just stop.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to call on Brad and then myself because we haven't spoken yet. And then
I have a headache.
Okay, thank you. Full disclosure, if I appear to support some of the points that Ted made, it's because Ted and I have been discussing these questions for years now, probably over maybe 8 years. So that's why. And I just wanted to respond to the 2 points that John made, and I don't want to do this in some sort of duke it out, we're in the boxing ring and we're going to figure out who's the better boxer here or the better debater. But I simply want to point out that we are in the United States confronted with the legacies, enormous legacies of the past, precisely in the anachronistic political regime that characterizes the United States. If we look around the world, almost every other capitalist political regime in the world that we can look at, including Russia, of course, has been remade through the course of the 20th century. Even Britain has, and its bourgeoisie has reformed itself more than has occurred in the United States in terms of the formal institutions and political structures of the political regime. We alone in the world, here in the United States, have essentially an early 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century constitution and political regime that was called the Jacksonian political regime. And it's still the Jacksonian political regime in its fundamentals, in its electoral fundamentals. It's an electoral regime as well. In the 19th century, the US bourgeoisie learned how to, through the Jacksonian electoral system, to cultivate mass followings, mass constituencies. At their core, these mass constituencies were petty bourgeois, we would call them in our language. Mostly rural petty bourgeois, mostly rural, patriarchally led household producers in the country, per Jefferson's ideal. And that structure has persisted down to our own time. Hence, the United States in the world system is truly an ancient regime, as was the French in the 18th century. And the anachronism of the regime itself plays no small part in the political crisis that we face today. Now, I promise also to try to relate this to John's comment about, and others' comments about the consciousness or lack thereof of the US working class, because those two are intimately connected up. Why? Because what the bourgeoisie learned to do in the United States was to wall off the electoral system to reduce it to a monopoly of two parties. Now, we like to say these aren't membership parties, you just vote for them, but actually they are membership parties. You become a member, you get elected to public office. And so Nancy Pelosi is a member of the Democratic Party by virtue of simply being elected to Congress. And both of the historic Jacksonian parties that emerged after the Civil War, by the end of the progressive era, especially by the New Deal, had learned to seal off the electoral system and therefore the political system as a whole from other parties. So no longer do you see, Debsian socialist parties or populist parties on the scene year after year with a semi-permanent existence. Instead, you see what I think Henry Lowy correctly pointed out is that the mass left today, when it appears on the streets, doesn't leave anything behind. It just disappears. And that's very correct observation. David McNally at the last socialism conference in Chicago noted that in his forum. Where did the millions of George Floyd protests, where did they go? They left no organizations behind. And this is quite extraordinary. Because, these leftists kind of know that it's an exercise in futility to butt your head against, to try to get independent access into this hidebound political electoral system, which is a complete monopoly of the bipartisans, okay, up until now, up until recently. So that in turn, that ancient regime in turn, was preserved by the simple fact that a big, rich, wealthy, imperialist country that after World War II was the most powerful imperial. It wasn't hegemonic, It wasn't dominant, but it was number one most powerful imperialist capitalist country in the world. It could obviously afford to create large new social layers of not only the domestic petty bourgeoisie, but to also for a time until the end of the 1970s to push social reforms, what I call social liberalism, the New Deal social liberalism, into benefiting layers of the working class, the old working class, the old white working class. As we know, since Reagan, the bourgeoisie has moved away from that, in my view, because they realized that even if it promoted backwards petty bourgeois individualist consciousness amongst privileged white workers, white male workers, let's say, it also made them stronger economically. They could go on strike easier, they could hold out easier, and that impacted profits negatively. And speaking of, how much time do I got?
You've been talking for 6.5 minutes, Brad.
Okay, so real quick on profits. I don't think, this is where I kind of differ with Ted, is that we cannot directly deduce from the tendency of the rate of profit to fall what is actually, we can't directly deduce from that what the trends are in the composition of the working class as well as the enemy class, the capitalist class. This happens indirectly through the process of capitalist social reproduction, okay, as opposed to the capitalist mode of production. It's two different concepts. And however, there is a relation in which if the rate of profit, the tendency is realized and the rate of profit falls, as it did in the 1970s, then you're going to see a movement of capital into parasitic economic activities. Now, again, in a big, rich, imperialist country like the United States that had its golden age of capitalism in the immediate post-war, in which a lot of us were born into, by the way, certainly could look at that and say, hey, we have this huge field to exploit, even if parasitically. And I'm jumping to my point here is that the Trumpian far right, if you look at the capitalists, or sometimes we call them provincial domestic, I call them this, provincial domestic Trumpian bourgeoisie. If you look at them, they're all domestically oriented. A lot of them are real estate or entertainment or casinos.
Brad, that's 8 minutes. You got to wrap it up.
Okay, so you get the picture. There is a distinct layer of the bourgeoisie, which may not be the big monopolies who have a world perspective and who like the way things were before. But there's a more important part of the domestic bourgeoisie that's behind the far right than I think some are willing to see. As I'm going to end off with individual workers voting for Trump. That doesn't really surprise me. Okay. Actually, Trump, the characters surprised me a little bit. I said, is the American system going to allow this guy to run? Well, they did, and they still haven't dealt with him. But, you know, it doesn't surprise me at all that U.S. workers who have never had the experience of political independent working class party on the one hand, and on the other hand, all of the things I just mentioned influencing them into essentially having a atomized petty bourgeois consciousness, even if they're working in a factory alongside other workers. And that is really all that's happening, is that Trump is appealing to the atomized petty bourgeois consciousness of backward workers. Tomorrow, those same backward workers could go somewhere else, even in a progressive direction. So I wouldn't rule them out. But
That's 10 minutes. You got to wrap it up. Come on.
Okay, so last thing is that the far right is on a roll in this, including in this country. And actually, I don't have time to explain that piece of it, so I'll end here.
Okay. All right. I'm going to call on myself, and I'm going to time myself for 5 minutes. And I have also, it's pretty clear that I think we need another discussion on this another time because there's way too much to say about it. I'm going to just talk about my own experiences. So I was a union activist for many years in a public sector union, AFSCME Local 444 in Oakland, which represented blue collar workers. I was a union steward, I was on the executive board, and I was president of that union. And during the 1990s was really the wave of, well, the modern wave of the team concept, which I think everybody here is familiar with, which is workers and employers have the same interests. And we could talk about where that came from and all that, but I think everybody here gets the idea that that has been the seminal philosophy of the union leadership in the United States and really other parts of the world too, but I'll just talk about the United States. It's been the seminal philosophy that has seeped down into workers' consciousness that, well, we really can't win anything. So, but if we're on the same side as our employers, then, you know, we can help them, they help us, et cetera, et cetera. And it is the philosophy or the strategy that has informed every union struggle since then. And I would argue that it is the reason, or one of the main reasons, in addition to the complete failure and rejection of actual organizing of workers, why union membership in the United States is now down to 11.2%. It goes down every year. And so we can talk about the UPS settlement that is in the process of being voted on right now, and I think will be accepted. And the fact that it looks good on paper, but really the devil's in the details. But in any case, so there's the UPS settlement, but there was also something that wasn't so much in the headlines this week, and it had to do with the bankruptcy filing or the shutdown of Yellow Lines, which is the largest, you know, one of the largest long distance trucking companies in the United States. That was basically absent from the news unless you were paying attention to it. It was also a unionized workplace, and the Teamsters decided not to have. They had voted for a strike, and then they decided because Yellow Line was not paying into their health and welfare fund. But they decided to cancel the strike. And then a month later, the company just decided to shut down. The Teamsters had the opportunity to say, hey, we stand for solidarity here. An injury to one is an injury to all. We are going to call on our UPS members and on Yellow Line, and we're going to shut both of them down. And we're going to win a victory here for everybody. But they don't do that. So what they did was they're promoting a TA that will give some wage gains and some other benefits, some other improvements in the to UPS workers that will undoubtedly be watered down and disappeared as they begin to automate certain functions. And there's always devils. So it's not the victory that they say it is. In any case, so the point of all this is that what is the impact that this has? Excuse me. Oh God, I'm sorry. I didn't start my timer. I apologize. I don't know how long I've been talking. Okay. Give me just a minute here. Should have asked somebody else to time me. Okay. What is the impact that this has on the consciousness of workers in the United States? What do they end up thinking about unions? Distraction in the chat. What will happen to those 30,000 workers who lost their jobs at Yellow Line? Where will they go? Who will they support? I would argue that a section of them will support Trump. Because who do the unions advocate for? Oh, well, the Democrats, yay, they're on our side. No, they're not actually. And so I'm not making them, never mind. I'm going to stop talking. Never mind. Whatever.
Come on, Cheryl.
I'm just losing my train of thought. I'm wandering all over the place. So it's okay. I don't
like a bunch of mansplaining here. We need some alternatives.
That's okay. I might come back in later. It's fine. No, I'm not being clear and I don't want to do that. So, okay. So we've got Ted and Linda and John. Stanley hasn't spoken yet, but Stanley, why don't you go ahead and then we'll go back to the rest of the list. And I see Ted took his hand down. I think he has to leave. I don't know. Stanley, and then we'll go back to who else is in line. Go ahead.
Well, I think we absolutely need an independent political party, an eco-socialist party, because otherwise people, workers, will not ever hear socialist ideas, just ideas of tinkering with the capitalist death system as it hurtles towards 2030, when we get to those climate tipping points from which we cannot come back. On the other hand, people are terrified of Trump. People who, voted for Greens or who just wouldn't stay home. I mean, in 2020, they were terrified, and I can understand it. Generally, people get terrified by Republicans anyway, because of the extreme, awful, racist messages they have. Now, I like Howie's ideas and talk about ranked choice voting and other things that can be done. I mean, another thing that goes on is in the Electoral College, states pledging that their electors will vote for whoever gets the majority or plurality in the country, and not on what happens within their state. But that's, not going to take over that soon. France has had an interesting left strategy, which is the various left parties run full out, criticize the liberals and so on. But in the end, they stop their campaigning after the first round, let's put it that way, and then do support the lesser of two evils. And I think that's a viable strategy for an independent party to say, we're going to run full tilt. And if you Democrats don't oppose our ability to speak, our ability to run in elections, as they have been doing for decades in this country, a month before November 2024, we'll pull out and support you. I know they have not, some people have mentioned that in the past, and Democrats don't care. They think they own the left vote and just want to smash the left. But I think it should be at least be said. And I wrote about this in 2020, so I put an article that I wrote in the New Politics magazine. I put a link to that in the chat. And the last thing I'm going to mention is on the 21st of this month is the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of the Ghouta sarin gas massacre in Syria. And we're going to mark that somehow with some kind of demonstration in Connecticut. And I hope people do that in some form in other places. Done.
Okay, so everybody that has their hand up has spoken already. So I'm going to go back to the top of the list and call on Ted because he has to leave early anyway. And then I'll call on John and then Linda.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I do have to leave, I'm sorry. But just a few quick points. First of all, I think we do need another meeting, as Cheryl suggested, at some point when it's convenient. Second of all, I hope Howie is right about Cornel West. I am very skeptical about Cornel West's positions on these issues. My own attitude towards the Green Party in 2024 is this. I will support the Green Party if it takes a position on Ukraine that is on the side of Ukraine. I remember the SDS, and I think Rick Sclater was probably around at the time, when the SDS said half of the way with LBJ. I don't want to go half of the way with the Green Party. On their domestic issues are good, more or less, but internationally they suck. But we need a third party. Forget it. I'm not half of the way with Cornel West. But I'll keep the door open to that issue based on your word, Howie. As on the point that Henry brought up on the disappearance of the mass movements the day or soon after Trump was elected, why was that? That's because the Democratic Party had already co-opted the leaderships of the women's movement and Black Lives Matter, and they told them, go home now. And they went home. It's not that the people who were out there demonstrating changed their mind. It was because of the fucking Democratic Party. One of the most important points here is the working class of the United States is not represented by the unions. As Cheryl pointed out, the unions only have approximately 10% of the working class in their ranks. 90% of the working class is outside of the unions. Who are the 90%? The immigrant workers, women workers, the young workers. In other words, the most progressive parts of the working class are not organized. Who's still in the unions? A lot of fat, old, white, racist men who voted for Donald Trump. And no wonder John's sister found out they voted for Trump. You know, their wives left them. Fuck you, asshole, I'm leaving. So, okay, I'll shut up about that. Falling rate of profit. Walter is right about China, but I don't think the rate of profit has actually been globalized. There are differential rates of profits within national borders, and even by economic sector. And what I was specifically referring to is the rate of profit in capitalist production within the borders of the United States. And Michael Roberts, I follow Michael Roberts too. His research is directed towards the average global rate of profit. Okay, I'm going to shut up, and I'm sorry I have to go, but I will pay attention to the rest of the contributions in the recording. Thank you very much, and take care.
All right, John, go ahead. You're muted, John.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say again, we cannot just continue looking at things in the same way that we did in the past. I want to respond to a couple of points, and I'm then going to return to that. As far as my supposedly anecdotal reports from Pennsylvania, I think that there's certain stereotypes involved here, comrades. Why should we assume, I can ask about this, but why should we assume that all factory workers are men at this point? And what and in response to what Ted said, we have to remember that there's huge sectors of the working class, the overwhelming majority, including industrial workers in the South, in the Midwest, and so on, like Wyoming and so on, the Plain states, who are non-union and are extremely poorly paid. And I didn't ask, I can ask about those factory workers in Pennsylvania. I'll bet you they are extremely poorly paid. So we can't just, impose this stereotype on them. Now, it's true that a higher percentage of men than women support Trump. So yes, that probably came into play, but let's not just stereotype them all, as I said. On the issue of organizing around Bernie Sanders, the entire campaign of Bernie Sanders is not me, us, and all that kind of stuff. When you look at it more in depth, what it was organizing to get out and vote for the Democrats. And he never, ever, and this is where I agree, I think Ted said it and maybe Brad, this is where I agree with them completely. The entire position of the Democrats and all of their wholly owned subsidiaries, like the NGOs and the union leadership, their position is your only political activity should be go out and vote every couple of years. And don't do anything more than that. Now, as far as alternative candidates and what Howie had to say, Howie gives the example of Howard Wallace, and it would be interesting to see how much Howard Wallace really had an effect on the vote. And he says, Howie says, well, third party left candidates increase the voter turnout. Well, how do you explain that in 2020? The support for the Green Party candidate, which was Howie, that support plummeted, but yet voter turnout actually increased. So I really don't see that at all. And in any case, look at the alternative. Now, Howie kind of, how can I put it without diplomatically? I think Howie severely underestimates the degree to which Cornel West apologizes for Putin, and at least let me put it this way, apologizes for the invasion. And it doesn't matter if he says Putin is horrible and the invasion is wrong. Up until now, Cornel West has done nothing but lend his voice and all of his effort to calling for an end for U.S., on the one hand, mischaracterizing the war as a proxy war, and on the other hand, calling for an end to U.S. support for Ukraine. And I think that Howie is being naive at best if he thinks that Cornel West is going to change his position on that. I've seen him twice on CNN, for instance, where that was the overwhelming thrust of his position. And the rest of it, if he denounces Putin and so on, it matters nothing. And I think Howie, I've asked him a number of times if he's going to support Cornel West, if he continues on that position, and Howie has not answered. I think it's clear at this point that he will, and I think that he is making a serious mistake. On the protests, like, for instance, the Black Lives Matter protests, for instance, particularly around George Floyd. It was very interesting. Here in Oakland, the working class here in Oakland is overwhelmingly people of color, Black, Latino, and also Asian. But the protests around George Floyd and similar protests were overwhelmingly white. And if you look at the photos and the videos from around the country of similar protests, you will see similar demographics. Now, what does that tell you? To me, what it says is that it's again a symptom of the relative passivity of the working class, political passivity. In this case, the black working class. So we have to, and this gets back to what Cheryl was talking about, and it would be completely idealistic, or else just a dogmatic reading of Marxism, to think that this 50-year war against all the best traditions of the working class, this 50-year war that the union leadership has carried out, that has not had a dramatic effect on the consciousness of the working class. So Linda mentioned who came on January 6th, who was arrested and so on. But that is not a good indication of the support for Trump, because yes, it's the petty bourgeois that is much more able to travel. So that really, like I say, isn't a very good indication. So to return to my main theme, you see a huge vacuum having opened up in American society and in American politics, where the capitalist class, their ability to influence the thinking and the activity of the working class and broader layers of society is at an all-time low, at least an all-time low for my lifetime. The reasons for that are many. The main reason is the 50-year attack on, 50-year attack on the standard of living of US workers. And they have nowhere else to turn because, for a variety of reasons, including the role of the union bureaucracy And so they turn to the far right, which is a process that we've seen elsewhere. I was hoping, and incidentally, in some ways, you see a similar situation in Israel today. So you have the weakness of the capitalist class and the weakness of the working class, and into that vacuum has entered the far right, which and in particular personified by Trump and those around him, those who mimic him. And so I don't think, just in conclusion, I think we have to think about what we in the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign can accomplish. And we're basically a tiny, tiny group, mostly of older people. We are not going to change the political situation in this country. But the socialist movement has proven it's, if anything, a fetter, or the great majority of it. It's a fetter on any kind of advance. And an entirely new socialist movement has to be built from the ashes of the old. And it cannot be built if we continue to impose a template from the past on this present unprecedented situation. We have to start to look at the world. We can't just abandon the past and abandon history and our understanding of history and theory, but we can't use our understanding of history as a fetter to prevent us from looking at the present situation. And if we do that, if we don't make that mistake, then hopefully the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign can play a small role in helping to build a new socialist movement out of the ashes of the old.
Okay, we're just coming up on 10 minutes, so good job wrapping it up.
Sorry about that.
Okay, Linda, and then, well, I'll call on Howie and then Brad. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to clarify something about what I said about super exploitation, and it really does relate to how we define groups of people, in the United States. I mean, Ted's position was that the gains made by groups that are normally super exploited within the first world are causing the big crisis within the ruling class. I mean, I may be misstating it. I think they are. The gains that women and minorities have made within the first world are posing a problem. But I'm not sure if it's actually an economic problem. I mean, I think it's more a matter that the ruling class depends on the support of groups that are racist and sexist, like like the churches and the Klan and so forth. I mean, in the third world, where the super exploitation is obviously the main issue, because I mean you wouldn't have all these imperial blocs fighting each other for influence in the third world, if it wasn't, and where people have managed to organize, and a lot of times it's only in the first world that they're able to do that because of various structural problems, including just the limited democracy that we have compared to the pretty much no democracy that so many other people have. So I mean, I just wanted to make that that clarification. And I'm not saying that super exploitation within the first world is irrelevant either. I mean, obviously there are some people that think it's very important. That they had spent 50 years trying to take away the right, to reproductive freedom from women. I mean, that's obviously, that's somebody that really believes in what they're doing. Most of it's out of just the kind of oppression that they want to impose on women that doesn't have much to do with capitalist surplus production, but it does, it can. I mean, anyway, I know what you mean about rambling. I mean, you get started on one thing and it's just like you realize that there's like 20 other issues attached to this one thing. So anyway, I'm not saying that super exploitation is a thing of the past. It certainly isn't.
Okay, so we kind of these meetings are generally 2 hours. We've got a half an hour left. I want to, and I'm being obviously being very generous with the time. And we've got 4 people with their hands raised. So that's going to take us up to the end of the 2 hours. So and there's a couple people who haven't spoken. Monique hasn't spoken. I don't know if she joined in a little late. I don't know if she wants to speak. I want to give her the opportunity to speak if she wants to. So Monique, I hope you're hearing me. So if you raise your hand, I will call on you because you haven't spoken yet. So okay, so I am going to, and please, we'll have another meeting on this. So it's like, okay, you don't have to get everything in right now. This is a huge topic. I'm going to call on people in the order that they spoke before, which I believe would be Walter, Howie, myself, and then Brad. So Walter, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't, okay, I didn't think I'd be called on so soon. There's a lot to say, and I think I want to repeat that I think people should put their comments in writing so that we can have a more organized discussion. But I just want to say more about super exploitation since Linda brought it up again. In order to combat the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which did have its effect, as I forget who pointed it out in the 1970s in the United States, one way to do that is to raise the rate of exploitation. That's hard to do in your home country because it becomes politically unpopular. Workers in this country have some strength because they can vote, because they can strike. But an easy way to avoid that was to move production to other places. The first thing that the productive capitalists did was move to the American South, which was ununionized and therefore had cheaper labor. Then they moved to Mexico, just across the border, where wages were like 1/8 of what they were in the United States. And then once China opened up, and it was a brilliant decision by the Chinese ruling class to open up their huge population of migrant workers, which they got by driving peasants off the land, opening them up to imperialist capital. And Chinese wages at that time, at the beginning of American exploitation, were like 1/20th of what American U.S. Wages were. So the capitalists make a killing, and they're still doing it. I forget who mentioned the oppression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China. One thing that the Chinese rulers do is build these labor camps for Uyghur workers. And who exploits the Uyghur workers? It's Apple and Nike and Volkswagen and Western companies. So the oppression of Chinese workers, which American politicians protest against all the time, is certainly in part to the benefit of American capital. Now, another reason that China might be oppressing the Uyghurs in particular, because workers throughout China have been fighting back, as again was mentioned by someone else here, and have raised their wages, so they're no longer as dirt cheap as they used to be. Even Chinese capital is now trying to look elsewhere, to Vietnam and Bangladesh and India, but that won't work. Aside from India, those countries don't have the population that China does, and India does not have the educated workforce, at least basically educated workforce that China has, doesn't have the superstructure and so forth. So the extent of super exploitation has almost reached its maximum, and that's going to restore the capitalist crisis that they tried to solve, that surfaced in the 1970s. They solved for several decades through super exploitation, but that may not last very long. Okay, I'll stop there on that. And again, I urge that much of the comments on these political questions should be put in writing so that we can think about them seriously.
We can save the chat. I'm not sure how to do that, but those.
I'm going to call on Howie and then myself and then Brad.
Okay, just to respond to a couple points. I think the difference of the Green vote in 2016 and 2020 is the larger dynamic of the election was totally different. 2016, the presidency was an open seat. We had a strong Sanders campaign, many of whose supporters were really angry at the Democratic Party. So there's this whole Dem exit movement toward the Greens as an alternative. In 2020, the larger dynamic on, left to center was anybody but Trump, and that's Biden. And I got more commentary on my campaign from people like Medea Benjamin and, Michael Albert and Bill Fletcher in open letters saying, don't vote for the Green, vote for the Democrat, and it was totally blanked out in the mainstream media. So, my vote, the Green vote collapsed. And I think that's independent of me or Jill Stein as candidates, because basically we're nobodies in the national media sphere, although Stein kind of has a certain presence given that damn picture she got at the RT event where she was totally used by them, and she still won't admit it to this day. But it's like Nader between 2000 and 2004. His vote collapsed because it was anybody but Bush after the Iraq War, even though Kerry was pro-war, but that's another story. And Cornel West, I have not heard him say he's for cutting off arms to Ukraine. I don't think he's taken a position on that. What he said in that CNN interview was he wants to see Russian troops out. And then somewhat contradictorily, he said out of negotiations, there are going to have to be some compromises on territory, which is a little different than Russian troops out of the whole place. And in discussions we had with Dennis Pilash the other day, we were trying to say that, what was on the table at the end of March, might be a resolution where, Ukraine is not part of NATO, but it has security guarantees, and the status of these areas in dispute are decided by UN supervised referendum. That, is something I think Cornel is more interested in. But we'll see. I think he's still developing his position. He's mainly saying negotiations, but he's not saying no arms. And as far as going on the Glenn Greenwald program, Cornel goes on everybody, and I'm not comfortable with a lot of who he goes on with. And this is before he became a candidate. What I recall from the discussion on Ukraine, it wasn't much with Greenwald, but Greenwald was kind of repeating the Russian narrative. And I think Cornel checked him saying, Putin is a gangster, Russia is an empire. And Greenwald changed the subject, as I recall. I don't have close memory of that because it wasn't much about Ukraine, even though it says so in the promotion of that episode. So I'm done.
Okay. I'd like somebody to time me so I don't have to worry about it. Who will do that? Linda, are you there?
Yeah, that's sure. How much time do you want?
I don't know. Just time me. And if I go past 8 minutes, let me know. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. So yeah, first off, just quickly on the question of writing, I think that's a really good idea. And especially for those of us who don't write, like myself, I think writing helps all of us clarify our thoughts. And that's one of the best reasons for doing it. So, and I think we really need to support and encourage people who don't write. So it's more balanced instead of, well, we know who the people are that write. I don't need to say any more about that. You know who you are. Okay. And we need to figure that out because we should prepare for that for the next discussion. I think that would be very helpful. So my entire life, I became a socialist, a Trotskyist when I was like 14 years old, something like that. Opposed the Vietnam War, opposed the Democratic Party, and never in my life would I ever have considered voting for a Democrat until Trump. And now I will vote for Biden. I can't imagine that between now and 2024, that magically a socialist candidate that I could support, who is solidly in the camp of international working class solidarity, is magically going to appear. I don't see that happening. If that person should appear and they actually have some strategy for talking to working class people, and they know, I find that that idea is impossible to imagine. So I want to talk about the indictment of Trump, the 4 indictments of Trump so far, and there's more to come, and how with every indictment, his popularity rating goes up. I know that's amongst his base, and it is hard to know exactly how many people support Trump in this country. But I do think that there are more than we can realize. And I'm going to give just one example. And also, I want to encourage everybody, including people outside the United States, although everybody here, with the exception of Henry, is in the United States. We should all start doing our own anecdotal surveys and asking people. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to give an example of an experience I had this week that was like, So we had a young guy come here and work on our bicycles. And he was about maybe in his late 20s, maybe 30 years old. And my neighbor was here, and she's an African-American woman, and she was working on her bike. And they had a very friendly conversation. I was doing other stuff, but I was sort of listening. And this young man had a really curious mix of right-wing ideas and left-wing ideas. And he is white, but he sort of had like some, again, leftist, populist ideas mixed in with these really. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm seeing this phenomenon amongst the young people that I know, including my wonderful stepson, who is a really good person, supports women's rights, is not a racist, but he thinks all politicians are corrupt. Biden's corrupt. They're all corrupt. So they're all just like apples. They're all apples. They're not apples and oranges. Trump is corrupt, but so is Biden. And he swims in the waters of libertarians because he works in the technology sector. I can tell you right now that in Silicon Valley, the libertarian thinking is rampant. And they hate Biden because they hate government. And this is what they've been told to believe. And that's all they talk about. And so in any case, so those are just two anecdotal examples from my own life about young people who think all politicians are corrupt and Trump. And right-wing populism is on the rise in this country. So I think we can't ignore that. So, and if Trump wins in 2024, from prison possibly, it will be a disaster for the working class in this country and around the world. Never in my life would I have considered voting for a Democrat until now. I don't need to repeat what I said at the beginning. So let me just see if there's anything else really important I want to say. The left is a disaster. I mean, we could say it's not just Black Lives Matter and the women's movement, the environmental movement. It's not, it is that they're tied to the Democratic Party, but it's also the result of the absolutely disastrous policies of the very isolated and marginalized socialist organizations, such as socialist organizations don't even exist I mean, like we're going to Socialism 23. Who are those people? Come on. Ordinary people don't even know who the hell they are. And my neighbor, the one who was talking to the young man, is a really great person. She's a teacher. She's a bilingual teacher. And she is very drawn to conspiracy theories because she doesn't understand what's going on. She talks to me about politics. She says, oh, you should have a podcast. She goes, where is the leadership? What should we do? Where should we go? That's what people are saying. What should we do? Where should we go? They don't see any answers. The left has provided zero answers. And so this is the situation we're facing. And whenever I mean, I was active in DSA. I don't know how much, Linda, how much time do I have left?
Let's see here. You're at 2.5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay. 2.5 minutes left?
Yeah.
Okay. I was active in DSA for a short period of time. And every time I went to a meeting, I felt like screaming, pulling my hair out. That was just the East Bay DSA. Maybe some branches are different. Maybe they're more political. It was a very apolitical. It was if the meetings were huge, maybe 200 young people, and they have all their little trendy things where they go, yay. It was a bunch of cheerleadings. There was zero interest in political discussion. The tradition of political debate has been smashed in this country. I had in my union, which was a lot of those fat white workers, we had debates, vigorous debates, and then we voted, and people understood that things had been clarified. Maybe that was because I was president and that's what I believed in. But at the same time, so that doesn't go on anywhere. People don't even know what a fucking debate is anymore. They have no idea. And whenever you try to do that on the left, oh no. We want to have unity here. Unity around what? So these are my very deep frustrations with the left. I could go on and on and on about it, but that's part of what we are in right now. Okay, so who's next? Brad lowered his hand, so I'm going to go.
Oh, no,
back.
I didn't. No, my hand's
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry, but you disappeared. The symbol disappeared. Okay, go ahead.
I might have accidentally done.
Okay.
It's my turn now. Okay.
Yeah, okay, and we're coming up, we've got 12 minutes left. We'll see what
Yeah,
happens. Go ahead.
quickly on Cornell West first. Well, first of all, yes, we will need to have periodic additional discussions, periodic ones, in sync with the political season, the electoral season. It's convenient. Because at this meeting, we're just beginning to clear the ground on what our common perspective should be. Okay, so anyway, on Cornell West, I cannot support his candidacy because in all likelihood, West, from the indications I see publicly, has to draw the support of what we call the Putinists, which bleeds over into what we also call the soft left in the Democratic Party. But he will need their support, and he will need to pitch to them to have a real campaign. And in fact, I think that's what he's doing, as others have noted. And as I've noted on the alias, the number one point, the main point of his campaign is for world peace, basically. And I think the push for world peace in a world dominated by capitalism is a reactionary utopia. And so objectively, his campaign will be a reactionary campaign, no matter how much West emphasizes progressive issues in the domestic arena. And so that's all I got to say about that for now, until West proves otherwise, as people mention. On this whole question of Trumpism, MAGA, the working class, its composition, we have to, anecdotes are useful pointers and guides from our own experience to direct us where to look and how to actually carry out an analysis that'll give us an objective sense of where workers actually are. And since politics has been up until this moment funneled through the electoral system, that requires an analysis of the electoral results, starting with the fact that out of the entire eligible adult population, on the average, only about 70% actually vote. So we know nothing electorally about the 30% who don't vote at all. So it's not inevitable that, you know, some white worker in the Midwest somewhere is going to, thinks the whole political system justifiably is rotten and corrupt and doesn't work for him, may not necessarily vote for Trump. He may just drop out, but we don't know that. And so we don't have a sense of what percentage of the most backwards workers, I'll just say, most petty bourgeois minded, where they actually go. But I would predict that in all cases, what both anecdote and analysis, including of the composition of January 6th insurrectionists, will tell us that the core of MAGA and Trumpism and of the far right is in the provincial petty bourgeoisie, okay, which can include petty bourgeois minded workers. But the core, as January 6th people demonstrated, are from the small business, self-employed, you know, this kind of riffraff of the petty American domestic petty bourgeoisie. And I think they're the core of the MAGA movement. Naturally, since there is no alternative for workers, they will attract petty bourgeois minded workers, since that's the only consciousness available to them in the United States, to them. But they are subsidiary. They are in the orbit of MAGA. They're the social periphery, you might call it, of MAGA, but its core constituency is not made up of workers. So that's an analysis, a statistical analysis, a serious analysis of the electoral results that start from the top, understand that the two parties, the bipartisan system only gets about 2/3 of the actual vote. Okay. The Democratic Republican parties, taken by themselves, are minoritarian parties, you know, in the mass sense, and works its way down to the precinct level, characterizing the precincts socially and economically, and then looking at what percentage of people voted in those precincts. You have to do this whole analysis to come up with an objective understanding of the subject matter we're talking about, which is where's the working class going politically, okay? The past, to the extent that I'm not sure what John means by imposing a template from the past. He can explain that in our next meeting. But to the extent that the past exists in the present, it's not a template, it's a reality. So the American political system, as I described in my last intervention, is an anachronistic political reality and not a template that has imposed itself upon the working class with the effects that everybody has commented on. For that reason, but interesting, I'm going to end off here. The anecdotes I've heard, especially from Cheryl, correspond to my view to a certain extent that there, even a Trumpy kind of young, white working class kind of person has some certain progressive things that they want for themselves, like don't steal my Social Security, for example, just as something as defensive as that. That means these workers can go in one direction or another, actually. And the direction we don't want them to go into justifiably, and they as justified in their own minds, is toward the Democratic Party, which they already hate. They already clearly and correctly understand what the Democratic Party is not their party. And they're right as far as that goes. So we as socialists cannot be indicating that something otherwise because, Trump is scary. The reason why Trump and the far right have momentum is precisely because of the anachronistic political system, which is a closed anti-democratic political monopoly of the two parties. That's what gives the far right momentum, and that's what creates the essential non-existence of a left in the an organized left in the US political system. So we have to understand how all those parts work together in order to understand why it is we should not be reinforcing the thing that has created this situation in the first place, which is the Democratic Party, which after all, I'll end here, is trying to save the Republican Party. Now, why would anybody want to do that? And I end there.
All right. So Howie and then Walter's going to get the last word because nobody else has their hand raised. So go ahead, Howie, and be mindful. Well, we can extend a few more minutes after 11. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I forgot to answer John's direct question. I would say at this point, I'm giving Cornel West critical support, and how critical it is largely depends on Ukraine. Frankly, he has other problems like getting this campaign together. He's got Jill Stein as the campaign manager. She's not a manager. She's not an organizer. And I just don't know. When I talked to him for 90 minutes, half of it was me giving him advice on, how to get a national campaign organized. I don't see it, but I'm not in that part of the campaign. And I'll tell you, there are Greens that are concerned that Cornel, somebody put, he's a left populist, but not a socialist. That's what a lot of, rank and file Greens, particularly the young Greens, are concerned about. The Green Party defines itself as eco-socialist, and I would say 3/4 support that. Maybe 1/4 actually understands very deeply what it means, but only about 1/4 is opposed to that self-definition. Cornel's, I think, weakness when he's on these media things is he's big on analysis and statements of values, but not real clear on policy. The policy, to the extent it comes out, kind of gets lost. So, Greens have been concerned, is he going to be for an eco-socialist Green New Deal? And he actually came out with a statement calling for the nationalization of the oil giants last week. So, that may, make them feel better about that. I talked to him about, national health insurance like Medicare for all is not enough, given private equity buying up all aspects of healthcare, and we need a national health service where the whole system is socialized and the people are public employees that work in the system. And I sent him materials on that. So I see my role as, trying to move him to a better place on Ukraine, a better place on some of the domestic issues, and hopefully, help him get some good people to, run the campaign. But I would say critical support is where I'm at right now. And, he's going to be the voice of the independent left in the presidential election. So to the extent, I can have an influence, I want to.
Okay, Walter.
Yeah, I want to answer both.
wait.
I want to answer both Brad and Howie. As people know, I wrote a document calling for a tactical support of the Democratic Party. As I tried to spell out, at least briefly, that involves attacking the Democratic Party. And the idea is to try to convince working people that, yes, Brad is right. People genuinely hate the Democratic Party because it is aimed at elitism. Hillary Clinton was its perfect representative, and making a campaign towards highly educated, wealthy people. So a campaign for voting for the Democratic Party has to explain it's purely tactical. Trump has to be stopped. Trump is a threat to the very existence of democracy. And anything that gets in that way is a problem. The Democratic Party is not a solution. It's just the only alternative in the election to Trump or whatever Trumpist Republican is nominated. So a campaign should be completely independent of the Democratic Party, should not send funds to the Democratic Party. It should protest the Democratic Party, but say, let's vote for them tactically to gain time to build a working class party. And therefore, now to Howie, I think it is criminally dangerous to support any third party that could draw votes away from the imperialist Democrats, putting it frankly, and enable the Republicans to get in. And yes, it's bad that Cornel West doesn't have a decent position on Ukraine, but that's secondary. The reason to oppose him is that his campaign will aid Trump or a Trumpist.
All right. Got 1 minute left. All right. Well, so I think it's pretty clear we need another discussion. I'm not sure when we're going to schedule that and how we're going to sort that out. But as far as writing goes, for like Ben in particular was asking in the chat about that, we have the USSC listserv, and for all of its problems, it does function well. Everybody received the, what Walter wrote, what Ted wrote, and what John wrote, if you're on that list. If you're not on that list, we're happy to add you to that list.